What's up guys, Steven Spikes at Spike Signal here, and today we're going to be talking about some of the songwriting and music theory behind Avenged Sevenfold's song Backcountry that came out on their third studio album, City of Evil. I feel like this song has a deceptively simple quality to it, but there was actually a lot more going on under the hood than I anticipated, so I'm looking forward to talking about it right now here on Spike Signal. This song is full of accidentals in a variety of places. I did find though that a classification of D minor made the most sense given the material. I've done my best to approximate what the implied chords are for each part of the song, as well as included the tablature down here for you to follow along on. And while some spots are a little bit messy, you should be able to get the general idea. A final thing to note here is that while there's not much of a difference in general, I did use the music video version of the song. The song starts right as things crash in. I started notation right after the "he who makes a beast out of himself" part. So this is where we'll go ahead and start on the intro. So even on that beginning part, we have several interesting things to talk about. First of all, rhythmically speaking, on the first measure, on the offbeat of 4, we jump down to the D minor, which characterizes the following measure, or at least part of it that can be seen here. It's quite a subtle thing that I never truly noticed until looking at it, but it is something that keeps things quite interesting, no doubt about it. Melodically speaking, they utilize a G sharp power chord in between the two D minor chords they have. There's a lot of ways this can be interpreted that I probably won't get into here, but a couple of the ways are viewing this as a power chord based off of the root of the sharp 4 of D minor, viewing it as implying a G major chord as I notated here, and perhaps evidence that this entire first part should be viewed in a different key entirely that's not D minor, though I decided not to go down that route for this analysis. Moving on to this section where the vocals come in for the first time. Rhythmically speaking, just like before, we have a chord change on the offbeat of 4 on the first measure of this part, as well as a chord that falls outside of the key once again. Similar logic can be used when describing the G sharp power chord here as in the prior few measures, so the couple reasons I cited as to why that might be going on here can be referred to again. So that's all I'd say about that. Though because they go back to the G minor here, I do feel like they're signaling this as being comprised of notes that are simply outside of the key versus the G sharp implying that this whole section would be from another key entirely. And I wanted to quickly note that for both of these sections, the bass is basically just mimicking what the guitar is doing. And now we get into the verse. And we actually played right along through the pre-chorus here. So again, for the verse, you have a couple ways you could look at it. Now, if someone was going to try to play full chords over this, what sounded best to my ears when I was testing was that this A flat right here have a D diminished chord played over it. My reasoning for that is that these 3 notes, ascending backwards, so to speak, outline a D diminished chord. We have the D here, the A flat here, the D here again. And when I say D diminished chord, I guess what I mean is the D diminished power chord with a 1, the flat 5, and the octave. Technically speaking, you should be able to play a D diminished chord over this entire part right here, given the fact that D here and D here are also of course the root of D minor. When I was testing, I felt that just playing D minors sounded best. Let's take a quick listen to the pre-chorus again. So we have a similar thing going on here as we did in the verse, but there are some differences. So for the first couple notes, we basically have a repeat of the verse, but then there are quickly some differences. Instead of going down to the D, we actually drop down to the G for the lowest note here. We then play that G's flat 5, which is D flat, in which I've noted playing a G diminished chord over would sound decent, before a movement that ascends and then descends diatonically within D minor, ending on the E diminished, which gives some great pull to go into the next part of the song. Now let's take a listen to the chorus. And apologies for the messy score here. Some of the formatting got messed up when I switched to this view. The first measure of the chorus is in D and does a little bit of rhythmic stuff as well as palm mutation to keep it interesting. It then goes to the G minor, which is the 4 of D minor, before coming to rest, so to speak, on the F major, which is the relative major to D minor. Not forgetting some pedal tones here and here for good measure. Then hangs out on the C for a while, which is the flat 7, which gives some good pull to the final measure of the chorus, before jumping back again to the flat 3, which is F, before doing an ascension that's on the flat 7, which is C, to give pull to the next verse, with a bit of an ascension here just to pull it a little bit more to going back to that D minor on the verse. The verse then repeats. And this time right here, the repeat is actually set to go 4 times. So there's more time given to the vocals to sing and do their thing, before finally moving on to the pre-chorus, which is a repeat of what we observed before once again getting to the chorus for the second time around. And then we go into the clean part. I do want to take a second to talk a little bit about what's going on the bass here as well. It sounds like the bass is hitting different octaves of the same note to keep things interesting, as can be seen right here, hitting this higher D before hitting this lower D, probably because the chords in the guitar are higher in comparison to their palm muted notes they're playing here, as well as some brief contrary motion, or in moving from the G minor to this D pedal tone, the bass moves from the G note down here and then ascends to the D here. It even has a little bit of a sequence right here underneath these relatively stable power chords that transition from F major to a D palm mute. Super subtle stuff here, but all things that add up in the long haul. And then during that little guitar ascension that we discussed before at the very end of the chorus, the bass right here basically follows the E and the F right here, because these two notes on the bass are E and F respectively. But for the first note of ascension, the D right here on the guitar, the bass is actually playing a G. Again, super subtle, but over time, all these variations do add up to create a more interesting final product. And now we're going to get into the clean part that comes right after the second chorus. Let's go ahead and take a listen to it. And it does repeat later on. We're going to go ahead and take a look at what's different on that part in a moment. Let's go ahead and start with the first 8 measures of this part. So as we can see right away, we have some interesting notation going on in some of these chords right here that captures some of the extensions that Avenged Sevenfold is using to get these interesting sounds. The riff starts on a D minor, which is the 1 of D minor, moving then to the G7 with a 2 extension, which is the 4. We then move on to a G major add 2. Typically in the key of D minor, the G would actually be a minor G, given the fact that it's 4 away from D minor. However, in this case, the B is natural, making it a G major. And at least for these 3 measures, you could almost consider this natural B modulating the whole passage here to C major. But I'm not going to look at this so much from a standpoint of modulation. Also, the add 2 is up here, as we have the 2 of G major in this A, as well as here, and also in the bass notes here. So basically, if you're factoring in all of the information right here, you could look at this whole passage as a G major 7, add 2. Moving on to the next measure, we have what I would say is a C major 7, add 2. The 2 coming from the use of the D notes right here, and the major 7 coming from this B natural, which again is an indication that temporarily we're more in the key of C, even though we're not looking at it that way right now. We then get into this very strange measure here, where we basically observe my best attempt to categorize all the notes that we see here. The add 2 comes from these notes here in the bass line that are E's and up here as well. The major 6 comes from this B natural right here. The flat A right here makes this D a diminished D instead of a D minor. And now that I'm looking at it, this double flat 7 right here would actually mean a 6 anyways, so this is a little bit redundant. We could just write it like this. Again, with something like this, there's a lot of room open for interpretation, so this is just one possible shot at it. We have an A minor 7 here with this B natural giving us an add 2. That carries on to the next measure for a total of 2 measures. 4 coming to rest on the F major add 2, which again makes me want to interpret this whole passage from the key of D minor opposed to the key of C major, given the fact that F major is the relative major of D minor. And the way MuseScore is notating this is kind of strange, but you could view this as a sus2 chord because there's no third and a root and a fifth. Also, the bass line is roughly outlining an F major as well, being the 1, the 3, 1 again, the 7, the 1, and the 7 respectively. As a quick correction, looking at these last two measures in the first time around for the clean part, I am thinking that these whole two bars are actually sus2s as well, given the fact that for both of them, an A note is nowhere to be seen, whereas there is a G note, instead only having a G note, which would make it a suspended second. You basically then have the whole part repeat. As you can see, there are a couple differences here. The bass part's a little more active right here underneath the D minor. And while this is technically the same, I decided to notate this D diminished chord differently with a double flat 7 instead of a natural 6, just a different way to say the same thing. And finally, we have a different movement coming in here. Now, as we can see here, we pretty much have the same thing minus the bass being a little more active right here, as well as an inharmonic notation to say a natural 6, which in this case is a double flat 7. I left that here just to show it. We do observe a difference here though. When accounting for the fact that the bass is playing an F way down here, we can imagine that there is an F note right below the C, that'd be here roughly. From that, we can say that the F is still the root of this particular measure, denoting the F, which then moves back to the F, which is its octave, before finally climbing up to the G, which is its second. And just like before, because there are no A's to be found in here, we would say that this is a sus2 again, specifically an F sus2. So basically, these last two measures are the same as they were before, even though we have a different movement going on here that builds a little bit of anticipation as we get ready to transition back to the part that I've labeled caught. And with that, let's get into the final part right before the solo. M Shadows has more lyrics here, so this part repeats 4 times instead of the 2 that we observed before. The notes that he's hitting with his voice are following along with his chord tones fairly closely if I remember correctly, and then we get into the transition to the solo. And I'm gonna pull out the solo part right here. I think I notated this solo properly, but sometimes the notes still sound kind of bad anyways. I'm thinking that's due to issues with the MuseScore sound font, though if there are any problems that need to be corrected, just let me know. Now let's go ahead and listen to the transition. Now to start off with, you'll see that I put a note here saying bend to note on lower string. Basically what that means is that along with the note that you see here, you're going to hit the note intervallically right before it on the lower string and bend up to it. And that's something that goes throughout this whole part. There's then a whammy dive here as we get ready to go into the solo proper. There's a lot going on in the solo, so it'd be very difficult to talk about everything that happens, but I'll try to pick out a few points of note as we go through. First of all, we see some utilization of 16th note triplets to add some speed, as well as a little bit of chromaticism right here. And in fact, even beyond chromaticism, I might think of this as the blues scale. So then basically adding in this sharp G right here to give it a bit of a blues sound. Though in the context of a song, it doesn't exactly sound like that. That is technically what that is. That G sharp is also hit here as well. By the way, there will be instances where we see multicolored notes right here if I've selected it. That means that there are different voices. So in the harmony, we'll see both harmony parts on one staff, but just know that they are played by 2 separate guitarists, both Sin and Zaki respectively. Let's go ahead and listen to the first part of the solo. Let's stop right there because there's already a ton to talk about. So while this isn't perfect notation, for these parts right here with the downward facing arrow thing, that shows that they're using a whammy bar to move down from the D to C here respectively before sliding up to the coming notes. It's a really cool effect that you wouldn't get from just playing the notes individually. I just decided to notate it this way because that's technically what the notes are. In listening to the track that I isolated, it seems like they hit a super subtle perfect fourth right here before sliding up. Once again, utilizing some tuplets to give a little bit of speed. Really relying a lot on that blues note with that G sharp. Sorry about the messy vibratos here again. Let me move those out of the way. And with D minor being the chord that they're playing underneath the solo, they're almost outlining that right here. You have some cool notes with staccato on them that also utilize the blues once again in triplet form. So really trying to use articulation to bring out elements in the song to make it interesting beyond just the melodies that they're doing. It's also worth noting that even though the rhythm guitar sounds very similar to the verses, there is this variation that happens right here, and they basically wind up in a different place than they do in the verses altogether on account of it. When I'm playing this song, it definitely doesn't sound right when you play it in the manner of the verse, so I'm gonna guess they were writing this part and they wrote the solo and they realized they needed to change up the rhythm to make it fit the solo better. But that is purely a guess. And though you can't hear it, I did notate here and here that there are lots of slides coming in and out of notes to just add another cool effect. Once again, hanging out in that G sharp again. And even within the melodic lines of the solo, using lots of interesting rhythms like going to 8th notes to 16th notes and then back to an 8th note on the and, just to kind of keep things fresh as well. We then have some aggressive bending right here. And in the actual track, especially listening to it isolated, you can really tell how hard he's writing that guitar string up. And it all adds a certain level of aggression that's a really cool thing to hear in a solo. With that, let's get to what I've labeled as solo 2. So a lot of crazy stuff going on here. So I'm going to take this little part bit by bit. Right here, you could view this as a sort of inversion of D minor, with this being your root note right here on D, and these Fs here, respectively, being your third. This movement is then moved up a third, where we now have the fifths of D minor right here, and the third of D minor, so still notes falling within the chord of D minor, but just moved up to increase the incitement and variability, all while staying inside the chord very well. When we go to what I've labeled as a D diminished implied chord, we have a somewhat similar situation with these G sharps being able to function as the flat 5 of D minor. And though they are the blues note as well, you could also think of all of the G sharps before this part of the song also functioning as the flat 5 of D minor within their context. And as we move on to this part right here, it gets a little bit more odd, admittedly. These C sharps could function as the major 7 of D minor, and this G would be functioning as the 6 of D minor. Not really an easy way to classify it, but it sounds cool nonetheless. They utilize a slur here as well. Just wanted to point that out. We then get into this super high part right here. So this one is admittedly a little bit odd. We have a G sharp right here, which is not what the chord is implying underneath it. It is merely implying a G with some sequencing around it. And honestly, for this part, I'll probably just leave it there. We then have these A's right here, which again is a little bit strange because underneath it, we have a D flat. We then have a part here, which is also quite strange. We have these A notes going on right here while there is a D flat going on underneath it, which would technically make the interval distance between this D flat right here and these A's right here an augmented fifth. Again, I'll just kind of say that and leave it there. It also ends on an interval that is a major second away from D flat. We then have the crazy chromatic part. Definitely a cool way to just have an insane guitar solo. Aside from the super crazy rhythm that has some variation in it, as can be seen here, I would best classify this as chromatic ascensions and descensions that slowly work their way up. See the chromatic movement here, and then here we observe it back down. Then right here we omit the chromatic movement to be able to move up further. The same kind of thing is repeated here with the chromatic ascension, a chromatic descension, until finally again the chromatic movement is omitted and we ascend higher. It looks like we have a similar chromatic ascension and descension here before finally ascending. We have a sequence at the very top that ends on a C sharp before moving down, before doing a final diatonic ascension upwards and coming to the harmonized arpeggio part. The chromatic lines do start on their chord tones here for the D as well as here for the F, and now that I'm looking at it, at E for the E minor as well. Though this chord change to E minor right here is not accompanied by an E tone right here. That being said, there are 3 places here on the D, E, and F respectively, where the initial notes of the chromatic movements follow along with the chord tones to give things some consistency. And then we finally get into what I have labeled as a transition into solo 3. And now we're going to get into the sweeping arpeggio part that comes right before the very melodic part of the solo. So in Muse score, that first note definitely didn't sound good because of this bend right here. In this particular part of the track, there are 3 guitars for a moment, the 2 first 16th notes that are actually harmonized, and then just this bend right here in this red voicing that's sort of carrying through from the last section. So in listening to this, the guitar is all by itself. There is a quick hit of D minor right down here, but other than that, there's no bass and no rhythm. Now, the interesting thing here is, from the best I can tell, tell, and the best that my ears lead me to believe, this arpeggiated part, while it is soaring up and down, is actually outlining the notes of a D minor chord. Here, it's very easy to see we have D and F respectively here, and as we ascend upwards, and I'm just going to use this part right here as an example for that, by the time we get to a note that would be outside of the D minor chord, we skip it and go back to D. So I'm thinking that what they're doing here is just outlining that in this first measure. In fact, it does seem to be that quite objectively from what I can tell anyways. Now this part is definitely a little harder to make out. I might say that it's outlining an E due to the lowest notes right here, as well as this jump in the distance between the two guitars respectively, holding both the E right here and the third of E right here on that G. We once again have the G sharp in here that's been used up front for so much, and likewise an octave up from that as well. We also have a natural D here as well. So I honestly can't say too specifically what's going on with any of this stuff right here. It does generally speaking look like it's outlining an E though. So if I had to say something for it, it would probably be that. And in fact, now that I'm looking at it more, I probably call it an E diminished 7, since we have this E right here, and because in this key, the E diminished chord is diminished itself. So kind of hard to say, but that would be my best guess at it. We then get into the extremely melodic part of the solo with a unique rhythm underneath it. So let's go ahead and take a look at this in context of the rhythm beneath it. Very classic Avenged Sevenfold sound to it, no doubt about it. So quickly taking a look at what's going on here in the rhythm, we have a D minor chord to start out with, moving to a G minor, going to a C, which is the flat 7 of the D minor scale, before quickly going to A minor, before actually hitting the harmonic minor adjusted flat 7, becoming a natural 7, which in this case is C sharp. So in the key of D minor, if you're going to play the harmonic minor scale, you adjust what would be the C to be a C sharp, and in that case, that gives us a C sharp diminished chord. Though in listening to the song, it actually sounded to me like they are omitting the 5th there, which would be the flat 5 in any diminished chord. So it still kind of has the quality of it, but it doesn't sound quite as intense. Though to my ears, when listening to it, instead of playing the flat 5 there, they are actually playing the flat 6, giving it a little bit of a, shall we say, suspended sound. Because the flat 5 is omitted, it doesn't sound quite as harsh as it would otherwise. Now within that context, let's go ahead and look at the solo. So for this first measure right here, we are in D minor. What we see right here is harmonies that start on the D minor. We see a harmony that is based off of D minor right here. We then see harmonies that are sort of revolving around D minor once again, as can be seen. Here we have the 3rd of the D minor chord and the 1 of it. So that's kind of a flat 6 harmony specifically. There's what could probably be classified as a passing tone here before getting back to the 3rd and the 5th of D minor respectively, for sliding up here to what would be the 5th and the 7th of D minor respectively, before transitioning to a G minor harmony right here. As can be seen, we have a G minor chord here, so we start this harmony based around that. A very similar thing as we observed before with the outline of the D minor happens for the G minor right here. We've got some passing tones in there, but otherwise we're outlining the G minor chord, and then we get to the flat 7, the C right here, which in this case is starting on the 3rd and 5th of C respectively, outlining the notes of C major before once again ending on the 7th and 5th, except this time it's the major 7th and the 5th. So these 3 measures right here all follow the pattern of outlining notes that are within their respective chords, and even if it's the 7th, carrying through with that approach all the way before changing to the next chord of the next measure. And then we have the measure that starts in A minor and then adjusts to the C sharp diminished, or if we wanted to say it in a different way, the C sharp sus 6. Part of me almost wants to call it a sus 6, but we have the flat 3 in there, so I probably will keep calling it a D sharp diminished. Now as the A minor is being played here, we are generally outlining the chord tones of it. However, I do notice that we have a C sharp in here. That's from the harmonic minor scale once again, before the actual C sharp diminished chord is hit. So that's kind of making me think that they're kind of telegraphing, if you would, what's going to be coming before they do it by including that C sharp in there while still on the A minor chord before the C sharp diminished chord. Now even on the C sharp diminished chord, we actually don't have any use of C sharp within it. We have what could be viewed as a passing tone to the third and the fifth respectively of C sharp diminished, but that's about it. And then as we move into what is essentially a repeat of this part, the only thing that's different from what I can tell is that they add these extra couple notes that before were just occupied by these notes on the first beat going all the way to the and of 2. Now on the 2 they actually have notes to just give it that little bit of variation, and I do think it changes the feel of the song quite a bit, even though all it's doing is adjusting what was a dotted quarter note before to have a harmony on the beat. It is a nice adjustment. Aside from that, everything else in this part is actually the same though, so let's go ahead and get on to what I have labeled the breakdown. So first of all, taking a second to understand the rhythm once again, we have a measure that is predicated heavily around the D minor chord once again, with some passing tones in there, before transitioning to the E diminished chord within the key of D minor. And this one I do feel quite confident about labeling in the manner that I have, given that we actually have the B flat in here that is necessary to be an E diminished chord. This descending thing going from the A minor to the G minor to the F major to the E diminished for this measure, just kind of a descension. And in the final measure of this passage, we have a D minor to this really weird, which given the fact that it has an A in the root, a D flat, and an F flat, I've decided to call it a G diminished no 1. Pretty weird. There's probably a better way to interpret this, but this is all I'm thinking of right now. Finally, then moving to the F major, which is a flat 3 of D minor, and then going to what I've called, for the sake of simplicity, an E diminished due to the key that we've been in this whole time and the root here, though there is some weirdness going on the bass with it. So again, sort of a strange chord. So with those being analyzed as best we could, now it's time to take a look at what's happening in the lead. Starting on the measure outlining a D minor, we have once again an outline of the chords of the D minor right here for it. And notice that when the passing tones come in for the rhythm, while these outlining notes of D minor are still held, they're not playing any new notes, no doubt to avoid clutter. We then outline chord tones of the E diminished chord, though once again without a fifth, while not playing any notes when these rhythmic melodic lines ring out just like the last measure, and then moving into a crazy chromatic part. This section we're going to take it beat by beat because each chord is outlined beat by beat. This line begins with the upper note in the harmony on A before sequencing around it, including the G sharp once again that's been utilized so much. Worth noting as well that since this note is the A, which is the root tone of A minor, this F right here actually is being played as the 6th of A minor. And it actually looks like what's happening here harmony wise is happening throughout the rest of this measure here. So in this case, the lead is actually staying consistent while the, so to speak, rhythmic lines that are harmonized themselves are changing underneath it. By the way, I just noticed this F looking very weird right here. Looks like I labeled this as an F because down here in the bass, it's playing an F. Still weird though, and probably could be interpreted better. Now the lead line does change here on the final measure of the solo right before the last verse. Starting on the D minor, the first beat of this measure, we again have chord tones with a little bit of sequencing around them. This super weird G diminished no 1 doesn't really follow that, and instead looks like it's outlining some kind of D type sequence given the fact that the root right here is D. Still really hard to categorize though, so I'm not going to change it for now. And then we finally get to the F, which is the relative major of D minor, which on top of that in the solo, just going off the notes right here, looks like it's outlining some kind of C major chord. So that's again kind of hard to tell. While this final beat in the solo right here, though I've labeled as an E diminished, has some strange stuff going on in the bass. Solo-wise, quite clearly seems to be outlining an A minor 7. General takeaways from this solo at large. No matter how complicated or fast your solo is, you can make it sound very cohesive to the rhythm by outlining the chord tones within the rhythm in the solo. This is called chord tone soloing, and you can basically get as crazy as you want, even utilizing a lot of chromaticism, just so long as you're loosely basing at least the downbeats off of what the chord tones are. And even though that was the solo, we actually have more soloing going on in the final verse. So let's go ahead and take a look at that now. So in the first part of the verse that basically revolves around D minor / D diminished, we slide out of the solo prior on chord tones of D. During the palm muted part with D, we ascend upwards and hit this B natural here chromatically for a little bit of extra tension when we return to D minor in the rhythm before going to that G sharp again, which once again can function as the flat 5 of D, making D diminished seem like a reasonable interpretation for this area here. We then have this passage that's definitely based around D minor, but utilizes that G sharp again to give it that diminished sound, and once again takes advantage of a natural flat, probably to once again increase the tension, before finally sharping the C, which is indicative of D harmonic minor. Then we have this part, which to me is essentially once again outlining a D, except using bends to get there from starting points of accidentals, with something similar happening here, and then using what I would probably consider passing tones to get back to one more harmonized bend that outlines the 3rd and 5th of D minor respectively, before one final part that plays a D in the lead along with the D in the rhythm, and an A flat in the lead along with an A flat in the rhythm. And once again, this A flat is the inharmonic of the G sharp that we've been seeing so much. And in the final measure of the last verse, we have this transition to what I have called the interlude here, where the line, "I'll make a beast out of myself," is repeated with other things. And in the lead, they're keeping the tension somewhat controlled by staying on the Ds, but increasing it by an octave with the duration of half notes. For the rhythmic part here, and while this can definitely be a confusing way to notate it, this is essentially 16th note triplets. So once again, they're utilizing tuplets to give some real speed to the song. And with that, we have completed all the lead guitar parts of the song. And now we're finally going to get into the interlude, which is essentially a completely separate kind of feel. So until the second part of this interlude, I'm probably not going to talk about the melodic elements of what's going on here too much. Instead, I want to focus on the rhythm. Whatever version of rhythm you want to use, either the version that I've put down here or the one that follows the ref's kick drum, the rhythm is done in such a way that even though the guitar part itself is very clearly sitting behind Shadows' voice, there's enough going on back there for your ear to be intrigued and to maintain interest, even though they could have probably just as easily played whole notes for most of these chords. They didn't. They went that extra step to put a rhythm to it, and that was really cool. As we saw before, we observed some chord changes on the offbeat of 4 at the end of some measures, again keeping that intrigue up, before having a nice pause before going into the second part of the interlude. Melodically speaking, we're also observing a natural B instead of a flat B, therefore making what was formerly an E diminished chord an E minor chord, though we're at least assuming it would be given the fact that we don't have a third to make a judgment on. Now, even though we just had an E minor right here, we actually go back to an F and later have a B flat major, which to me implies that even though we just had an E minor, we are now back in the key of F major / D minor. We move to the C, which is the flat 7, to the B flat, which is the flat 6, and we actually hang out on the B flat for a bit, which is kind of interesting because due to that extra measure hanging out on the B flat as well as the final measure, this part of the interlude is actually a total of 6 measures, opposed to the only 4 measures that we observed before in the first part of the interlude. And finally, in our last measure of this interlude, I've denoted as an A major in first inversion, which is what this /C sharp means right here. I say this because these are the 3 notes from A major, except C sharp, from what I can tell best to my ears, is being played on the bottom or in the root position if you would. So that would make this an A major in first inversion. And we have the last chorus, and before I play it, I'll note that I actually didn't notate the final clean part of the song. I felt that all the meat of the song was concentrated well enough in the parts of the song that are in the music video, which the final clean outro is not in the music video, so I just decided to cover that. But we're not done yet because there's one last thing I wanted to talk about in this chorus, and that is the simple fact that the bass here is ever so slightly different, to me anyways, than it was in the other choruses. Just another cool example of how adding variation, even where you least expect it, can add a nice element to a song. And then we have the 2 measures of the outro. just D minor with some palm muted stuff right there. And that is my songwriting, sheet music analysis, music theory analysis, whatever you want to call it, for Backcountry by Avenged Sevenfold. I really hope you got a lot out of this and can use the techniques that we talked about in your own personal songwriting. Before looking at all of this, I actually consider this to be a more simple song when compared to some of Avenged Sevenfold's other stuff, but now I see that's just totally wrong. There's a ton of very subtle things happening to keep the listener engaged, even if what's happening to keep the engagement up isn't all totally in your face. If you got something out of this, I'd really appreciate you liking the video and subscribing, but most importantly, tell me what you thought of my analysis here, like what was wrong, what could have been improved. There were certainly some harmonies across all of the band members that I really wasn't sure what was correct on, so if you have any ideas as to better ways to classify those, that would be great for me to know. And if you have any songs you'd like me to cover, just let me know. I can't guarantee that I'd be able to cover any and all requests, but any songs similar to this of a rock or metal nature that have a very modern metal sound to it, I'd love to take a look at them. So let me know what you think, and until next time, I'll see you right here on Spike Signal. Thank you.